The bombing has stopped, but nobody in Washington, Tehran, or Tel Aviv believes the war is over, and that silence hanging over the Persian Gulf tonight is louder than any explosion, because after 13 consecutive nights of American airstrikes pounding targets across Iran, the guns have gone quiet, and the question ripping through every intelligence briefing room on Earth is simple: is this the beginning of peace, or just the eye of the storm? For nearly 2 weeks, U.S. Central Command hammered Iranian military infrastructure night after night in what analysts are calling the largest rekindling of open conflict since the fragile April ceasefire collapsed, and then, without warning, the strikes simply stopped. And into that vacuum steps U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz, standing before the cameras on back-to-back Sunday shows, delivering a message that is equal parts olive branch and closed fist, telling NBC's Meet the Press that President Trump is giving these fragile, high-stakes talks some space, some room to breathe, while in the same breath warning that the United States military remains, in his words, locked and loaded, ready to unleash devastating force again the moment Tehran miscalculates. And that phrase, locked and loaded, is now echoing across every command center from the Pentagon to Bahrain to the decks of American carriers cutting through the waters near the Strait of Hormuz. Because make no mistake, this is not a stand-down. This is a loaded weapon resting on a hair trigger, and everyone from Moscow to Beijing is watching to see who blinks first. And behind closed doors at the White House, the picture is even more volatile than the calm public messaging suggests, because just days before this pause, Trump himself told reporters he was considering a massive attack bigger than ever before, and that he was close to making a decision. And sources inside the administration now confirmed that in a tense Friday meeting, Trump and his top national security officials debated a full-scale escalation of the war, with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane reportedly raising urgent concerns in that very room, concerns that go straight to the heart of America's ability to sustain a prolonged fight, because whispers of a dangerous truth are now leaking out of the Pentagon, a truth Waltz spent his entire Sunday morning trying to bury, the truth that American munitions stockpiles have been stretched to their limit, drained by years of supporting Ukraine against Russia and grinding operations against the Houthis in the Red Sea. And while Waltz insists he has verified this every which way and that the U.S. military has everything that it needs to keep fighting, current and former officials tell a very different story behind closed doors, describing far greater anxiety among Pentagon planners who argue the military desperately needs new funding just to replenish what's been burned through, weapons that may be needed not just for Iran, but to deter far larger threats looming on the horizon in China and Russia. And that tension between public confidence and private fear is the real story simmering underneath this ceasefire, because if America is quietly rationing its firepower while projecting total strength, the entire calculus of this standoff shifts overnight, and Iran knows it, or at least suspects it, and that suspicion alone could be enough to embolden a regime that Waltz himself describes as fractured and divided from within, telling Meet the Press that there is internal fighting inside the Iranian government right now, with some factions pushing to seek guidance directly from the supreme leader, while others are demanding an entirely different, more aggressive path forward. And that internal chaos inside Tehran's leadership is exactly why diplomacy has been so agonizingly slow, even as talks are reportedly happening, in Waltz's words, at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels. Negotiations quietly advancing through intermediaries, including a revived diplomatic channel through Pakistan that reportedly has the backing of China itself, a stunning detail that reveals just how many global powers now have a stake in whether this war reignites, because a wider war in the Gulf doesn't just threaten Iran and Israel, it threatens the entire global economy, and you can already see that fear rippling through the markets, because the moment word spread that strikes had paused and diplomacy was gaining ground, Dow futures jumped over 260 points, S&P futures climbed nearly 50 points, and Nasdaq futures surged more than 300 points, while crude oil prices did the opposite, plunging over 4% as traders bet that a wider Middle East war, one that could choke off the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply flows every single day, might finally be avoided, at least for now. But here's what should unsettle every single person watching this unfold. Because even as his own ambassador stood in front of national television insisting the administration is giving diplomacy a chance, even as Waltz repeated the phrase "some space" over and over trying to project calm, President Trump did something that sent an entirely different message to the world. Because hours after those interviews aired, Trump posted a series of AI-generated images directly to Truth Social, images depicting American forces striking Karg Island, one of Iran's most critical oil export terminals. And in one particularly striking image, Trump himself is shown standing triumphantly on the deck of a captured Iranian oil tanker, an American flag gripped in his hand. And whether you read that as theater, as strategy, or as a genuine signal of intent, one thing is undeniable. The President of the United States is publicly rehearsing the destruction of Iran's oil infrastructure on social media at the exact same moment his diplomats are begging for patience. And that contradiction is the entire story of this war right now. A government speaking out of both sides of its mouth, one hand extended for peace, the other resting on the trigger. And Waltz didn't stop there either, because in a separate and even more explosive interview on CBS's Face the Nation, he revealed that President Trump has personally warned both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping not to assist Iran in targeting American forces across the Middle East, saying, quote, "The president has put both on notice, frankly, that they should not be assisting and that bad things will happen if they are." And that warning did not come out of nowhere, because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has alleged that Russian satellite surveillance of U.S. military installations across the Gulf may have been quietly shared with Iran, a claim that, if true, would mean this is no longer a two-nation conflict at all, but a proxy battlefield where Russia's war in Ukraine, America's confrontation with Iran, and the broader global power struggle between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing are all colliding in the same dangerous airspace. And Zelensky himself added fuel to that fire this weekend, announcing in a Telegram statement that Ukraine achieved what he called good results with long-range strikes deep into Russian territory, including a strike on a warship in the Caspian Sea and vessels allegedly transporting military cargo linked to Iran, meaning Ukrainian missiles are now hitting targets tied to the very same Iranian supply chain the United States is trying to shut down thousands of miles away. And if that sounds like the entire world is being pulled into one interconnected conflict, that's because it is. And meanwhile, on the ground, Iran is not staying silent either, because Iranian officials have condemned recent Ukrainian strikes, and Iran's foreign ministry confirmed its deputy foreign minister sat down for direct talks with Oman this weekend, specifically focused on the safe passage of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a clear signal that Tehran understands exactly how much economic leverage it holds over the entire planet through that single choke point. And back in Washington, the politics are just as combustible, because Senate Majority Whip John Barrasso is publicly warning that Democrats are actively trying to limit President Trump's authority to confront Iran, framing this as not just a foreign policy fight, but a domestic power struggle over who controls America's next move in the Middle East. And CNN's own analysis published just hours ago put it bluntly, describing this as yet another fork in the road for President Trump, and warning that with every single fork he reaches, his available options only grow narrower, and the cost of any decision, whether that's escalation, diplomacy, or standing pat, only grows more severe. Because Waltz argues Iran is diplomatically isolated, economically isolated, and militarily devastated, insisting, quote, "They've never been so weak, and we're negotiating from a position of strength." And in purely military terms, he may be right, but that framing ignores the terrifying asymmetry still sitting at the heart of this crisis, because as long as Iran retains the ability to fire drones and missiles at commercial and military vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz, it holds the power to detonate the global economy at a moment's notice, regardless of how weakened its conventional forces have become. And that is the trap the United States finds itself in tonight. A military that is locked and loaded but possibly running low on ammunition. A diplomatic effort that is ongoing but tangled in Iran's own internal power struggle. A president posting AI war fantasies to social media while his own ambassador begs the world for patience. A global economy holding its breath over a single narrow strip of water, and two nuclear-armed rivals in Russia and China circling this crisis like sharks, deciding how much closer they want to get. And as this fragile pause hangs by a thread tonight, the only certainty is this: the next move, whoever makes it, will not just decide the fate of Iran or the fate of the Strait of Hormuz. It will decide whether the world is standing on the edge of a wider war or the beginning of an uneasy peace. And right now, nobody, not Washington, not Tehran, not Moscow, and not Beijing, actually knows which one it's going to be.